In the heart of the Pacific, Japan's mighty empire believed itself untouchable. But beneath the waves, an invisible threat was silently reshaping the course of history. Allied submarines prowled the oceans, targeting the lifelines that fed entire cities, armies, and fleets. Grain, rice, and essential supplies vanished from Japanese ports, leaving commanders scrambling in disbelief. Reports of convoys destroyed, warehouses empty, and starving civilians reached the highest offices in Tokyo, and no one could stop it. For the first time, Japan's leaders faced the terrifying reality: their empire could be weakened not by bombs or battles, but by hunger. Every shipment sunk was a silent weapon of devastation, every empty harbor a reminder of vulnerability. This was war at its most cunning, most ruthless form, and the shock of it would haunt Japanese commanders forever. The question remained: could an empire survive when its stomach was empty and its pride shattered? By the early 1940s, Japan's expansion across Asia had created an empire of staggering ambition, but one built on a fragile foundation. Dependent on imported food and vital supplies, the empire's strength lay not just in its armies, but in the steady flow of resources from distant lands. Yet, as the war dragged on, the Allies uncovered a silent yet devastating strategy: submarines lurking beneath the Pacific, waiting to strike at the heart of Japan's supply lines. Convoys carrying rice, grain, and essential goods were relentlessly hunted, leaving ports empty and cities vulnerable. Japanese commanders, accustomed to planning bold offensives, now faced an invisible enemy they could not confront directly. Hunger began to creep into the empire, turning soldiers into desperate men and civilians into shadows of their former selves. Each sunken ship, each destroyed convoy, became a weapon more powerful than any artillery shell. The shock of losing control over the nation's food supply would rattle Japan's leaders to their core, and change the course of the war in ways they never imagined. By the late 1930s, Japan had transformed itself into a modern industrial power, but its rise carried hidden vulnerabilities. Unlike some other nations, Japan's geography imposed severe limits on domestic agriculture. The mountainous terrain and lack of arable land meant that the empire could not produce enough rice, wheat, or other staples to feed its growing population and rapidly expanding military. To maintain both civilian stability and military strength, Japan relied heavily on imports from territories under its control, such as Korea, Taiwan, Manchuria, and eventually occupied regions in Southeast Asia. Rice, sugar, and grains flowed into Japanese ports in vast quantities, along with soy, edible oils, and other essentials. Factories depended on imported raw materials to produce military equipment, while cities relied on food imports to prevent famine. The empire's leadership understood this fragility, but few anticipated just how vulnerable those supply lines would become in the face of a determined enemy. The reliance on maritime transport created a single, critical vulnerability: if supply routes were disrupted, entire regions could be left starving. Japan's commanders, confident in their naval superiority, believed their vast fleet would protect shipments, but the Allies had begun developing strategies to exploit this dependence. Submarines, stealthy and unpredictable, became the ultimate tool in this new form of warfare, capable of striking with devastating effect far from the front lines. By 1942, as Japan expanded further into Southeast Asia, the empire's appetite grew. The occupation of the Dutch East Indies promised oil, rice, and other critical supplies, but moving these resources across thousands of miles of ocean made them increasingly vulnerable. Even minor losses at sea could ripple into major shortages on land. Japanese leaders faced a stark reality. An empire that appeared unstoppable on maps was, in reality, tethered precariously to supply lines stretching across hostile waters. This dependence on imports was more than a logistical detail, it was the Achilles heel that would soon be exploited, leaving commanders stunned and civilians desperate, changing the nature of warfare in the Pacific forever. As Japan expanded its empire, the Allies recognized a critical vulnerability beneath the waves: the vast ocean supply lines that fed the empire. The U.S. Navy and Allied forces devised a bold strategy to target these maritime arteries. Submarines, once primarily used for reconnaissance or limited attacks, were transformed into instruments of economic warfare. The goal was simple but ruthless: starve Japan by cutting off its food, fuel, and essential supplies, turning the empire's strength into a liability. U.S. submarines prowled the Pacific, lying in wait near major shipping lanes and choke points. Commanders studied shipping schedules, convoy routes, and port logistics to strike with maximum impact. Silent and almost invisible beneath the waves, these submarines could attack without warning, leaving merchant vessels and lightly armed escorts powerless. Every torpedo fired had the potential to destroy months of preparation, millions of tons of essential goods, and the morale of those dependent on them. The strategy was not only tactical but psychological. Japanese commanders, trained for conventional naval battles, struggled to adapt to an enemy that could strike anywhere, anytime. Convoys that once seemed secure were now vulnerable, and the constant threat of submarine attacks forced Japan to divert military resources from the front lines to escort and protect shipping. Every loss at sea meant not just a logistical setback, but a growing sense of vulnerability at the highest levels of command. Submarine commanders became masters of stealth and patience. They followed convoys for days, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Night attacks and surface ambushes were common, and many Japanese vessels never saw the predator that destroyed them until it was too late. Over time, this relentless pressure began to choke the empire, as shipping losses mounted and vital supplies failed to reach their destinations. By the end of 1943, the effects of the submarine campaign were undeniable. Food shortages began to appear in Japanese cities, factories slowed, and military operations faced severe constraints. The empire's leaders, once confident in their control of the seas, were forced to confront a new kind of warfare, one fought not with battleships and air raids, but with patience, precision, and the silent menace of submarines prowling beneath the waves. The Allied submarine strategy proved that the most effective weapon against Japan was not always explosive. Sometimes it was hunger itself, delivered with calculated precision. Japanese commanders, stunned by the scope and effectiveness of this campaign, had to grapple with a reality that no amount of strategy or pride could immediately fix. By 1943, the effects of the Allied submarine campaign were beginning to ripple through the Japanese Empire in ways that shocked commanders and civilians alike. Essential food supplies, rice, wheat, sugar, and other staples, were increasingly failing to reach ports and cities. Warehouse shelves emptied, and Japanese officials faced the grim reality that their empire's survival was being dictated not by battleships or fighter planes, but by the relentless assault of submarines beneath the ocean's surface. In cities such as Tokyo, Osaka, and Yokohama, shortages became apparent. Markets displayed fewer goods, and the prices of available food skyrocketed. Civilians were forced to make difficult choices, prioritize children, the elderly, or soldiers stationed at the front. Stories emerged of entire neighborhoods struggling to secure enough rice to survive, while rationing programs, hastily implemented by the government, could barely keep pace with the mounting crisis. The Japanese army, long confident in its logistical systems, found its troops increasingly vulnerable. Soldiers reported delays in receiving supplies, and units stationed on remote islands or in forward positions faced severe hunger. Commanders were stunned as reports of starvation and malnutrition reached the highest levels of the military hierarchy. Strategists who had previously focused on grand offensives now confronted a more insidious threat, an enemy that attacked the empire's lifeline rather than its front lines. Allied submarines sank not only freighters but also smaller cargo vessels, creating a sense of chaos and unpredictability. Each lost shipment represented weeks or months of effort, and there was no immediate way to replace it. Japanese leaders attempted to adjust by increasing domestic production, stockpiling resources, and redirecting convoys, but the ocean was vast, and the submarines proved relentless. Hunger became a weapon, slowly weakening the empire from the inside out. As desperation mounted, the psychological toll on commanders was profound. For the first time, Japan's leaders realized that the empire's expansion had overextended its logistical capabilities. The pride of a nation that once believed itself self-sufficient was replaced by fear and frustration. Civilians, soldiers, and commanders alike faced the devastating truth: the empire could be defeated without a single decisive battle, simply by starving it of the sustenance it depended on. The starvation campaign would leave an indelible mark on the history of the Pacific War, reshaping strategies, undermining morale, and proving that even the most formidable military power could be brought low by the quiet, calculated destruction of its food supply. Japanese commanders, stunned and increasingly desperate, now faced a threat far more dangerous than any fleet. They were fighting to keep their people alive. As the Allied submarine campaign intensified, certain attacks became pivotal moments that sent shockwaves through the Japanese command. One of the earliest and most significant events was the attack on the convoy carrying rice and essential supplies from Southeast Asia to the Japanese mainland. In the early months of 1943, American submarines intercepted a series of heavily laden freighters off the coast of the Philippines. Despite Japan's naval escorts, the submarines struck with precision, sinking multiple ships and leaving valuable cargo at the bottom of the sea. For Japanese commanders, accustomed to conventional naval confrontations, the effectiveness of these stealth attacks was both alarming and demoralizing. Another critical event was the sinking of the Teo-class escort carriers, which were tasked with protecting merchant convoys. Their destruction left vital shipping lanes exposed and further emphasized the Allies' control beneath the waves. The loss of these carriers not only disrupted the movement of food but also forced Japan to divert naval assets from offensive operations to defensive convoy escort duties, stretching the empire's resources even thinner. In addition to large-scale convoy attacks, small-scale engagements also played a decisive role. Submarines would shadow single freighters for days, waiting for the opportune moment to strike. Night attacks, surface ambushes, and torpedo salvos became routine, leaving Japanese captains in constant fear of the unseen threat lurking below. Reports from the Japanese Navy described crews watching helplessly as their ships went down, the cargo of vital food supplies lost forever. By mid-1943, the cumulative effect of these battles was staggering. Entire fleets of merchant vessels were decimated, and Japanese commanders were forced to revise their logistical plans repeatedly. Attempts to reroute shipments, increase convoy protection, or accelerate domestic production could not keep pace with the relentless submarine assaults. Each attack magnified shortages, intensified civilian suffering, and sowed doubt within military leadership. These key battles demonstrated a new form of warfare, one in which victory was measured not solely by territorial gains or fleet destruction, but by the ability to strangle an enemy's lifeline. Japan's commanders, once confident in their naval supremacy, were now struggling to manage an empire under siege from beneath the surface. The strategic brilliance of the Allied submarine campaign would leave an enduring legacy, proving that the most effective attacks often came not from overwhelming force, but from precision, patience, and relentless pressure. As news of the relentless submarine attacks spread, Japanese commanders were plunged into shock and disbelief. These were leaders trained for conventional battles, skilled in maneuvers and strategy, but they now faced an enemy that operated in silence beneath the waves. Reports of lost convoys, sunken freighters, and dwindling food supplies reached Tokyo and regional command centers with alarming regularity. The magnitude of the disruption left many officers questioning their assumptions about naval superiority and the invincibility of the empire. In strategic meetings, commanders debated frantic countermeasures. Some proposed reinforcing convoys with additional warships, while others suggested rerouting supply lines through more remote, less predictable paths. Yet each decision came with limitations. Escort fleets were insufficient, alternative routes were longer and more dangerous, and submarines could appear almost anywhere along the vast Pacific expanse. Frustration mounted as every attempt to regain control seemed to meet with failure. Personal diaries and military reports from the period reveal the psychological toll of this campaign. Officers expressed feelings of helplessness and humiliation, recognizing that their meticulous planning was being undone by an unseen, seemingly omnipresent force. For many, it was a humbling experience. the realization that an empire's strength could be undermined not by a massive assault or brilliant tactical strike, but by persistent attacks on its lifeblood, food and supplies. The reaction was not limited to strategic circles. Civilians and lower-ranking officers felt the ripple effects as well. Word of the shortages and the empire's vulnerability spread through the ranks, undermining morale. Soldiers stationed far from supply lines grew anxious, knowing that provisions could be delayed or denied entirely. Commanders, witnessing the human suffering, felt the pressure not only to win battles but to preserve lives in an increasingly dire situation. By late 1943 and early 1944, Japanese leadership faced a sobering truth: the empire's reliance on maritime supply lines had become its greatest weakness. The submarine campaign had exposed a vulnerability that no amount of naval planning or pride could immediately fix. Commanders were forced to adapt, innovate, and accept the limits of their control, while the Allied forces continued to tighten the grip, demonstrating the strategic power of hunger as a weapon. The relentless submarine campaign against Japan's supply lines had consequences that extended far beyond immediate shortages. By systematically starving the empire, the Allies forced a fundamental shift in Japan's strategic calculations. Commanders who had once focused on ambitious offensives and territorial expansion were now compelled to confront the fragility of their logistical networks. The inability to secure essential food and resources limited the empire's capacity to sustain prolonged military campaigns, weakening both land and naval operations. Industrial production, heavily dependent on imported materials and fuel, began to falter. Factories that supplied the military with weapons, ammunition, and vehicles faced critical delays, slowing the pace of operations on multiple fronts. Troops stationed in remote islands and contested territories experienced supply shortages that affected combat readiness, morale, and overall effectiveness. Japanese planners realized that even with tactical victories in localized battles, the broader war effort was being undermined by a strategic problem they could not easily resolve. The psychological impact on leadership was equally profound. High-ranking officers and bureaucrats recognized that their confidence in Japan's invulnerability had been misplaced. The empire, once thought secure and self-sustaining, was now at the mercy of a persistent, patient enemy exploiting the simple yet devastating principle of cutting off sustenance. Each sunken cargo ship and lost convoy highlighted the growing power of attrition warfare, showing that victory was not only won on the battlefield but also in the control of resources. By the war's later stages, Japan's vulnerability to starvation contributed directly to its declining ability to resist Allied advances. Civilians endured rationing, hunger, and growing despair, while military commanders faced impossible decisions about prioritizing limited supplies. The lessons of this campaign echoed in military strategy for decades. Even a mighty empire could be brought to its knees through careful, targeted disruption of essential lifelines. Ultimately, the Allied submarine operations reshaped the Pacific War. They demonstrated that precision, stealth, and understanding an enemy's dependence could achieve results that brute force alone could not. Japanese commanders, stunned and forced into reactive measures, were confronted with the stark reality that the war was being lost not only in battles but also on the empty decks of freighters and in the starving ports of an empire stretched too thin. The story of Japan's empire being starved by Allied submarines is a stark reminder of how warfare extends far beyond the battlefield. It was a campaign waged silently beneath the waves, where precision, patience, and strategic insight proved more devastating than any frontal assault. Japanese commanders, once confident in the invincibility of their supply chains, were forced to confront a new reality: an empire could crumble not only through military defeat but through the loss of its very sustenance. Civilians faced hunger and deprivation, while soldiers saw their combat readiness diminished, all due to the relentless disruption of supply lines. The psychological toll on leaders was immense. Plans that had once seemed unassailable were now undone by an unseen enemy. This campaign reshaped Japan's strategic capabilities, forcing commanders into constant defensive maneuvers and reactive strategies. The long-term impact of this silent war cannot be overstated. It influenced the outcome of battles, altered production priorities, and demonstrated that logistics could be as decisive as firepower. By targeting the lifeblood of an empire, the Allies proved that understanding and exploiting weaknesses was often more powerful than brute strength alone. Ultimately, the Starvation Campaign became a defining chapter of the Pacific War. It stands as a testament to the ingenuity and resolve of those who fought beneath the waves, and a sobering lesson for any nation. Even the mightiest empire is vulnerable when its foundations are ignored. Japanese commanders, stunned and unprepared, witnessed firsthand how hunger became a weapon, leaving a legacy of strategic brilliance and human suffering that would echo through history.